Bloodborne is one of those games where the longer you look at it, the more it gives back. And tonight we're going through 501 details hidden inside its boss fights that most players have never stopped long enough to notice, collected across years of replays, footage analysis, community research, and a document that grew so long, I eventually had no choice but to turn it into this. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I put this together because I kept a running document every time I played Bloodborne, and every playthrough added to it. At some point it crossed 200 entries, then 300, and I realised it was either going to sit on my hard drive forever or become something like this. So here we are. The specific choice I made when assembling it was to ground everything in what the game actually shows you. Item descriptions, animations, sound design, level geometry, environmental detail. Where things get interpretive, I'll flag it as a possibility. I left out a lot of fan theories that are compelling but can't be verified in-game. What made the cut is material, where the game is quietly, deliberately pointing at something. That's the standard I held everything to. The other choice I made was to organise this by boss rather than by topic, because the connections land harder when you're already inside a specific encounter and the detail you're hearing relates directly to what's on screen. Some of these will be familiar to long-time fans of the game. A lot of them won't be. Either way, we're starting from the very beginning of the hunt. Chapter 1. The Beasts of Yharnam. The Cleric Beast is the first boss you encounter in Bloodborne, and its name is doing more work than most players give it credit for on a first playthrough. A cleric, in the context of Bloodborne's Victorian Gothic setting, refers to a member of the Healing Church, the religious institution that distributes blood ministrations and controls the spiritual life of Yharnam. The name tells you directly that whatever this enormous howling creature once was, it was a church official who transformed. The game hands you that information in the title of the boss and then trusts you to sit with it, because nothing in the fight itself explains it. That restraint is characteristic of how Bloodborne approaches its lore throughout, handing you a key and trusting you to eventually find the door. The Great Bridge, where the cleric beast is fought, has a subtitle in the Japanese version of the game that translates roughly as the Graveyard of the Beasts. This name doesn't appear in the English localization, which kept the area name neutral, but the Japanese subtitle suggests that From Software originally intended this bridge to read more explicitly as a place associated with fallen hunters and failed transformations. The graves lining the bridge support this reading even in the English version, and the visual of an enormous beast pacing among tombstones under a full moon becomes more pointed when you know the intended name. It's a small localization difference that quietly changes how you read the entire encounter before a single attack is thrown. The chains visible on the cleric beast's body have generated two distinct interpretations in the community, and neither is definitively resolved by the game. The first is that church personnel chained the beast after it transformed, containing it on the bridge rather than destroying it, possibly because destroying a member of the clergy publicly would have raised uncomfortable questions. The second interpretation is that the chains are part of some kind of ritual associated with the transformation process itself, restraints applied during rather than after. The fact that the chains are on a cleric specifically, a person of institutional religious authority, adds a layer to whichever reading you prefer. Chaining one of your own, whether to contain or to ritualize, is disturbing in different ways depending on what you decide it means. If you pause in central Yharnam and look toward the Great Bridge from a specific elevated position near the early rooftops, you can see a large shape moving against the moonlit sky. It's distant enough that most players don't register it as significant, especially during a first playthrough when everything is new and threatening. But on a replay, knowing the layout of the game, that silhouette is clearly the cleric beast pacing the bridge, before you trigger the encounter. From Software placed that detail in a position where it can only be appreciated by someone who already knows what they're looking at, which makes it a reward for repeat engagement rather than a hint for newcomers. It was always visible. Most people never saw it. The cleric beast's roar, audible when you cross the Great Bridge before engaging it as a boss, triggers a response from Father Gascoigne in the area below. There is a specific audio trigger in the game's code that causes Gascoigne to vocalize when the cleric beast calls out, and this exchange is not incidental level design. Gascoigne, who is progressively losing himself to beasthood, responds to the cleric beast call in a way that suggests the beast part of his nature recognizes something in that roar. A hunter at full capacity would not respond that way. The exchange between the two auditory presences suggests that Gascoigne's transformation is already further along than his controlled exterior implies. The grab animations of both the cleric beast and Father Gascoigne in his beast form share a specific kinetic structure, a reaching and pulling motion that prioritizes holding the target close rather than throwing or smashing it. The similarity in grab design points toward a deliberate visual connection between the two fights. Both are humanoid bodies in states of bestial transformation, and both retain enough of their original anatomy to express aggression through holding rather than purely through clawing. From Software has said through design rather than words that these two creatures are expressions of the same process, and the shared grab is one of the clearest statements of that relationship available in the game. The moon visible during the cleric beast encounter is a constant presence in early Bloodborne, and something players typically tune out as atmospheric background. But the moon in Bloodborne is not simply a visual element. It is connected in specific lore terms to the moon presence, the Great One that has created and maintained the hunter's dream. Seeing the moon prominently positioned behind the cleric beast on the very first boss encounter of the game is either coincidence or an early visual statement about what this entire narrative is actually about. Given how deliberately the rest of the game's visual design works, it reads as the latter. The moon was always the point. The cleric beast just happens to stand in front of it first. The cleric beast's model has a distended belly that doesn't match the rest of its skeletal, elongated body type. Most of the beast is stretched and angular, and the abdominal area looks bloated by comparison. Some community readings suggest this points toward the blood ministration process, specifically that this cleric received so much of the old blood in their religious duties that their body became saturated in ways that altered their physiology before the full transformation occurred. The visual of a church member whose body was distorted by the very substance they administered is consistent with the broader lore about what blood ministrations do to people over extended exposure, and the cleric beast's model seems to preserve a record of that process in its proportions. The death animation of the cleric beast includes a moment where the body collapses in a way that briefly exposes what might be the remnants of church vestments caught within the creature's mass. It's brief enough and the camera angle makes it difficult to see clearly, but there are geometric shapes in the collapse that don't match the organic chaos of the rest of the body and that look structurally like rigid institutional clothing. Community members who slowed down the footage have debated this detail without reaching a consensus, but its presence in the model's design suggests that the designers built some material memory of what this creature wore before it transformed. The clothing outlasts the person wearing it by a few frames, then everything collapses together. The voice of the cleric beast is a combination of multiple layered audio sources, and one of the components buried in that mix has been analysed by community audio engineers as a reversed human vocalization. Bloodborne uses reversed audio in several contexts to suggest the presence of something that's been inverted from its natural state, consciousness, or identity running backward against the surface of whatever has consumed it. Applying that technique to the voice of a transformed cleric who should be chanting prayers forward rather than backward, suggests a specific kind of horror about what beasthood does to identity. The prayers are still being performed. They've just been turned around. The specific placement of the cleric beast as the first boss is a structural choice that rewards reflection. In most games, the first boss is a tutorial obstacle or a proof of concept for the combat system. In Bloodborne, the first boss is also a statement about what the entire game is about. People who committed themselves to a religious institution, received its sacraments, and were destroyed by them. Meeting the transformed remains of a cleric before you've met a single living church member inverts the typical narrative order and puts the consequence before the explanation. Every time you later encounter a living church official, you're meant to remember what they're going to become. The cleric beast is not just a tutorial boss, it's a thesis. The great bridge connecting central Yharnam to the cathedral ward is architecturally a threshold between the public face of the city and the church's institutional territory. The fact that the cleric beast is found precisely on this threshold reads as symbolically deliberate. It marks the point at which you're about to enter the church's domain, and the warning it provides is not verbal but physical. Here is what awaits you on the other side of this architecture. A church that transforms its own members and leaves them on the boundary between itself and the world it serves. Cross this bridge knowing what you're walking into. The cleric beast has a specific passive behavior pattern before it detects the player, pacing the full width of the bridge in a repetitive loop. If you observe it from the gate before triggering the encounter, it moves with a restless, automatic quality, back and forth, like an animal in a cage that has forgotten why it was caged and is simply enacting the residual anxiety of containment. That pacing is distinct from how it behaves once combat starts, and the contrast suggests two animated behavioral states were constructed: a passive, trauma-encoded movement loop and an active predatory response. The passive state is where you can most clearly see that something is wrong with this creature beyond its size. The cathedral ward gate that the cleric beast is pacing near is specifically sealed before the boss is defeated, requiring the player to circle around through the Yharnam streets to find an alternative route. This detour through the civilian areas of central Yharnam before reaching the church's institutional spaces is a structural choice that gives the player a thorough view of what the blood plague has done to ordinary residents before they see what it's done to the church's own members. You see the congregation before you see the clergy. The cleric beast is waiting at the boundary, and when you finally reach it, you've already seen the full scope of what the blood has done below it. Father Gascoigne is introduced through one of Bloodborne's more elliptical, environmental narratives, and understanding his backstory requires assembling information from his item descriptions, his daughter's dialogue, and the positioning of his encounter near a specific grave. The short version is that Gascoigne was a foreign hunter who came to Yharnam, built a life there, and then participated in enough hunts that his beasthood gradually advanced beyond his ability to contain it. The night you arrive in Yharnam is the night he crossed a line he couldn't come back from. The encounter with him is not a boss fight in the conventional sense. It's an intervention that came too late. The music box that Gascoigne's youngest daughter gives the player is described in its item text as playing a soothing melody associated with his wife, Viola, and the functional effect it has in the fight, briefly interrupting his beast phase, suggests that the melody is tied to something in his remaining human consciousness that the beast cannot fully consume. The fact that his daughter knows this, knows to give a stranger this specific tool to use against her transformed father, implies that the family had already developed strategies for dealing with his episodes before tonight. This was not the first time they had seen him start to turn. The music box is a tool that had already been tested. The item description for the music box uses the word beloved to describe the song it plays, and that word is doing specific work. Beloved implies that the song is associated with Viola, Gascoigne's wife, whose name appears on one of the graves in his encounter area. Viola died during the night of the hunt, killed by a beast, and the song she loved is the last connection Gascoigne's beast consciousness has to his human life. When you wind the box in his presence and he pauses, what's happening is that the melody is reaching the part of him that remembers being a husband and a father, and for a moment that memory is stronger than the beast, only for a moment, and then the beast takes back over. Gascoigne's hat persisting through his beast transformation is a detail players notice and debate because it doesn't make physical sense. The transformation into a large bestial form should dislodge a small hunter's cap almost immediately, but Gascoigne's hat stays on for an extended period before finally falling. The game doesn't call attention to this, it just happens. The most straightforward reading is that this is a deliberate animation choice to maintain visual continuity with the human Gascoigne during the early part of the beast phase, so players can track the transformation as a process rather than a sudden event. The more poetic reading is that the hat, a symbol of his identity as a hunter, is the last thing to leave him. The beast arrives before the hunter does. The grave that Gascoigne is found kneeling over when you first encounter him has been confirmed through community environmental analysis to be associated with Viola. The positioning of the scene, a large man in hunter's clothing kneeling before a grave while the sounds of the hunt echo around him, is composed with enough deliberateness that it reads as From Software staging a specific emotional moment. What's particularly effective is that you don't initially understand what you're looking at. Gascoigne looks like a hunter pausing before an enemy, not a man grieving his wife. The recontextualization comes after you've already killed him, which is structurally effective and a little devastating if you've been paying attention to the NPC dialogue that explains who he was. The connection between Gascoigne and Gehrman's hunting tradition is suggested through fighting style rather than through explicit lore. Gascoigne uses the hunter axe and blunderbuss, weapons squarely in the tradition of the old hunters, and his approach to combat mixes aggressive melee with firearm interruption in a way that mirrors the tactical philosophy Gehrman supposedly developed and passed on. This places Gascoigne in a lineage connected to the very origins of the hunt as an institution, which makes his fate to be killed by a hunter at the beginning of a night of the hunt carry additional weight. He is a product of Gehrman's legacy being ended by a new product of that same legacy. The hunt consumes its own. The name Gascoigne derives from a real French historical region, Gascony, and the anglicised form Gascoigne was historically used in English to denote someone from that region. In the context of Bloodborne, this names Gascoigne as explicitly foreign, someone who came to Yharnam from elsewhere. The healing church and its hunters drew from across the world, and the lore implies that foreign hunters were sometimes recruited or drawn to Yharnam by the promise of the blood or by the reputation of the hunt. Using a French regional name for a key hunter character signals his outsider status while keeping him within the game's broadly European Gothic naming convention. He came from somewhere else. He could never leave. The transformation audio during Gascoigne's fight contains a layered moment just before his full shift into beast form, where a sound has been identified by community audio analysis as resembling a human voice breaking under strain. It's layered under the louder transformation effects and requires specific audio settings to hear clearly, but it's distinct from the general sound of the transformation itself. If intentional, it places this moment in a category of sound design choices Bloodborne makes throughout, using the audio layer to communicate what's happening internally, while the visual layer communicates what's happening externally. The breaking voice is the human being lost. The transformation sounds are the beast arriving. Both happen simultaneously. The music box in the Gascoigne fight is optional. The game never requires you to use it. You can complete the fight without ever winding it up in his presence. This means the game is presenting an emotional tool, a way of reaching the humanity of a transformed person, and making it entirely the player's choice whether to deploy it. Some players do, some don't. The ones who don't are playing a slightly more brutal version of the encounter, killing the beast without attempting the last available avenue of human contact. The game makes no comment on the choice. Both are valid outcomes. That absence of judgment is part of what makes the design of this encounter so considered. The Gascoigne item set description, available after defeating him and purchasing his gear from the messengers, provides details about his history that the boss fight itself doesn't offer. The description frames him as having been a particularly effective hunter, whose decline was unusually rapid, suggesting an exposure to the old blood that exceeded what most hunters sustained. The rapidity of his descent is mentioned in a way that implies it was notable even by the standards of a city that regularly lost hunters to beasthood. He didn't fail slowly. Something accelerated the process, and the item descriptions suggest it was the sheer volume of his participation in the hunt rather than any moral failing. The blood-starved beast is found in the Church of the Good Chalice in Old Yharnam, and the word good in that church's name is a piece of irony that the game places without comment. Old Yharnam was burned by the healing church to suppress a beast plague, an act of institutional violence against the city's poorer residents who had received inferior blood ministrations. Finding a particularly vicious beast living in the ruins of the Good Chalice Church suggests that whatever goodness was being practiced there before the burning was thoroughly consumed by what the church did and left behind. The name of the church remains. What the name was meant to represent does not. The environment of Old Yharnam itself is one of Bloodborne's more explicitly tragic areas. The architecture is still recognisably similar to the rest of Yharnam, which means it once looked like the areas the player has already moved through. What separates it is the systematic destruction, charred timber, collapsed floors, permanent scaffolding suggesting the area was being restored and then abandoned, and the specific visual of a city that was deliberately set on fire from the outside. The blood-starved beast living in this space is the only major living creature in an area otherwise successfully cleared by the burning. It either survived the fire or moved in after. Both are disturbing in different ways. The blood-starved beast's second phase transformation is the moment many players first register how pronounced Bloodborne's body horror can become. The outer layer of the creature's skin peels back to reveal a thinner, more elongated shape underneath, and this transition is accompanied by a shift in behaviour from somewhat controlled aggression to frantic, pain-driven attacks. The shape revealed underneath is closer to a slender humanoid than a beast, with proportions suggesting a much smaller original body was subjected to a transformation that stretched and expanded it outward. The outer layer that peels off is not armour or shell. It appears to be the beast's own accumulated tissue, suggesting that the creature has grown layers over its original form in a way that normal biology doesn't explain. The blood spray in the third phase of the blood-starved beast fight is canonically blood rather than poison, which matters because of what blood signifies in Bloodborne's thematic framework. Blood is the healing substance the church distributes, the corrupting agent that causes beasthood, and the medium through which the Great One's influence flows into human biology. The creature using its own blood as an offensive weapon in its most desperate phase inverts all of those meanings simultaneously. The substance that heals, corrupts, and connects becomes a projectile in the hands of something that has been consumed by its need for it. The game treats it mechanically as poison, which suggests that at this stage, the blood has become indistinguishable from something toxic. The item dropped by the blood-starved beast, the Thumru Chalice, is the keystone for the entire Chalice dungeon system, and its connection to this boss is worth thinking about carefully. The creature appears to be either a Thumerian survivor or the product of experiments conducted on Thumerian subjects. The Thumerians were the civilization that first made contact with the Great Ones and built the underground structures that became the Chalice dungeons. By dropping the chalice from this boss, the game creates a chain. You kill what the Thumerian contact produced, and in doing so, you find the door back to where that contact occurred. The monster yields the key to its own origin. The Church of the Good Chalice Arena retains its ecclesiastical architecture in ways that are both familiar and wrong. The pews are arranged in rows facing the altar. The candles are lit, though how they remain lit in an otherwise ruined structure is unexplained. The altar at the back of the room is still dressed as if for a service. Fighting the blood-starved beast in this preserved liturgical space creates a specific visual argument. The church's ceremony is still being performed here, just not by humans. The creature that inhabits the space has become the congregation. The altar it crawls around is still dressed for worship. Something is being honoured. It's just not what the church was built for. The movement behaviour of the blood-starved beast is specifically erratic in a way that distinguishes it from the other beast bosses. The cleric beast is large, and its movements are sweeping. Gascoigne in beast form is aggressive, but readable. The blood-starved beast surges and retreats, and repositions in a pattern that doesn't follow predatory logic as cleanly. This erratic quality reads, once you know the lore context, as withdrawal behaviour. The blood-starved in its name is not metaphorical. The creature is in a state of desperate physiological need, and its movement patterns reflect that need's disruption of any coherent hunting instinct. It's not stalking you, it's in crisis. The lighting setup in the blood-starved beast's arena is unusual even for Bloodborne's generally dark aesthetic. Torches and candles create pronounced shadows throughout the church, and the creature's movement through those light and shadow zones creates an effect where parts of it are periodically hidden, while others are illuminated. This is not accidental level design. From Software's environmental team is meticulous about lighting, and placing a fast-moving, skittish beast in an environment that periodically conceals portions of its form serves both the gameplay purpose of making it harder to track and the atmospheric purpose of suggesting that what you're fighting is partly present and partly something else. The light never fully reveals it. Dark Beast Parl's optional status in the main game is a structural choice connected to the creature's thematic role. Parl is encountered in Yharnam, a location explicitly associated with the church's more covert operations, and the game allowing you to pass through the relevant area without triggering the encounter reflects a design philosophy where the worst things are hidden behind doors you don't have to open. The majority of players complete a first playthrough without fighting Parl. That majority also misses specific item unlock pathways tied to the encounter. The game rewards deliberate engagement with something it doesn't require you to face. The visual design of Dark Beast Parl is distinct from every other beast in Bloodborne because it reads as geological or elemental rather than biological. Where the cleric beast is flesh and sinew, and the blood-starved beast is skin and blood, Parl appears to be a skeleton, conducting electricity through tissue reduced to near transparency. The visual of lightning arcing between exposed bones has an almost scientific quality, like a specimen in a laboratory or a diagram of an electrical system. This design language places Parl in a different category, something that has been processed or transformed by an additional force beyond the basic beast curse. It was already a beast when something else got to it. The name Parl has been analysed by the community in connection with the Dutch word for pearl, and while the linguistic connection is unconfirmed by From Software, it fits within the pattern of Bloodborne's naming conventions. Pearls form inside creatures in response to irritants, which as a metaphor for how the beast plague forms inside humans is quietly apt. Pearls are also associated with the moon in various folkloric traditions, which connects to the moon presence that undergirds the game's entire narrative. If the name is deliberate, it's doing a considerable amount of quiet work without anyone in the game ever saying it out loud. Bolt damage in Bloodborne is classified as an elemental type associated with the Healing Church's more advanced research, particularly the choir's investigations into the electrical properties of celestial phenomena. Parl conducting bolt electricity through its body places it in a position relative to the Church's research that's unusual for a beast. Most beasts are byproducts of the blood. Parl appears to have been specifically exposed to or altered by something the choir was working with. Whether that was deliberate experimentation or an accident of proximity to something the Church was researching isn't clear, but the specificity of bolt as a damage type suggests intentionality rather than random mutation. Dark Beast Parl's location in Yharnam and the conditions under which it's encountered there point toward a deliberate narrative decision about what Yharnam represents. The unseen village is where the Church hid what it wanted hidden, including people who had witnessed too much of the Church's research. Parl, as an experimental subject gone wrong, fits the profile of things that end up in Yharnam: too dangerous to display, too significant to destroy, too compromised by the Church's methods to acknowledge openly. The village and the beast are both secrets, and finding them in the same space suggests they share a common origin in the Church's desire to conduct research without consequence. The telegraph behaviour of Parl's electrical attacks is interesting because the visual charge-up, where electricity builds in the creature's frame before it discharges, mirrors how actual electrical systems behave. Most Bloodborne boss tells are rooted in biological movement, muscle coiling, and weight shifting. Parl's tells are electrical. You are not reading an animal's body language when you dodge its attacks. You are reading a discharge pattern. The fight asks you to engage with the creature on its own terms, and those terms are closer to machinery than biology. It's the only boss fight in the game that essentially asks you to think like an electrician. The reward for defeating Dark Beast Parl is the Spark Hunter badge, unlocking specific shop items, including bolt paper and the Tonatrus. There's a specific irony in defeating a creature that exists as a consequence of the Church's bolt research and receiving the tools the Church developed to conduct that research. You're not just killing a beast, you're inheriting a methodology from its body, which is consistent with how Bloodborne positions the hunter as someone who absorbs the history of what they fight through the act of killing it. The beast yields its secrets in death whether or not it consented to them in life. The footstep sound design for Dark Beast Parl is specifically engineered to sound like something conducting electricity through a stone floor. Each step produces a sound that's part impact, part crackle, and the layering gives Parl a physical presence that's distinct from the other bosses. When Parl moves quickly, the electrical crackling in its footsteps increases in frequency, creating an auditory tension that builds as the creature accelerates. This kind of sound design specificity, where a character's audio signature reflects its elemental nature, is characteristic of From Software's approach to bosses whose fundamental nature is meant to register through every interaction. The health bar size of Dark Beast Parl is notably generous compared to where the player would typically be when encountering it in the critical path, and this imbalance is evidence that Parl was designed as a significant test for players who seek it out rather than a progression gate for average play. The fight is punishing in proportion to the choice to engage with it. This design creates a specific relationship between Parl and the player. You chose to open this door, you chose to engage with this creature, and the difficulty is the game's acknowledgement that you knew what you were getting into. Most players die to Parl the first time. Most come back. The death animation of Dark Beast Parl contains a detail that rewards careful observation. As the creature collapses, the electrical energy conducting through it doesn't immediately dissipate. There's a brief moment, just a few frames, where the skeleton continues to arc with electricity even as the body falls, as if the current has to finish its cycle before the body is fully inert. If you watch the death animation carefully, the electricity outlasts the creature by just enough to suggest that whatever energy Paarl was conducting didn't originate entirely from within its own body. Something was passing through it. When Paarl died, that something still needed to complete its circuit. Chapter 2. The Healing Church's Kept Secrets. Vicar Amelia is one of the most visually imposing bosses in Bloodborne, and her context in the cathedral ward gives the encounter a specific weight before the fight even begins. Amelia holds the title of Vicar, a significant position in the church hierarchy, a leader entrusted with performing the church's most sacred rites. The Grand Cathedral, where she's encountered, is the most prominent landmark in the church's public-facing territory, and finding its vicar transformed into a massive, furred beast who has chained herself to the altar suggests a specific sequence of events. Amelia transformed, recognized what was happening, and chose to restrain herself rather than flee. She stayed in the place of her religious office. The chains she wears are self-imposed. The prayer animation that Vicar Amelia performs during the fight, where she kneels and appears to genuflect while regenerating health, is one of the most commented on moments in Bloodborne. The visual of a massive beast praying at an altar while regenerating is striking, but what makes it an Easter egg in the fuller sense is what she's praying to. The altar she faces contains the gold pendant, and the gold pendant is the item that initiates the memory of a prayer which unlocks the password for Byrgenwerth. The prayer Amelia performs during the fight is connected to the same object and the same sacred knowledge that the game will later require the player to access through her body. She's guarding and worshipping and transforming, all in the same space. The specific gesture Amelia makes during her prayer phase is a beast approximation of a human genuflection, a pose recognizable as devotional despite the scale and the biology of the creature performing it. This is a specific animation choice by From Software. The decision to make a transformed beast perform an identifiably human religious gesture, and it serves a narrative purpose beyond spectacle. It establishes that Amelia has not lost her faith. She has lost her form and her ability to function as a vicar, but whatever the church asked her to believe in, she believes in it still, even from inside a body that has become the opposite of what the church publicly represents. Faith persisting through beasthood is one of Bloodborne's more quietly horrifying ideas. The gold pendant dropped by Vicar Amelia is described as containing a prayer from a woman who has lost everything, and the text doesn't specify who the woman is. Community analysis has connected it to Amelia herself, with the pendant serving as a record of a prayer made at the moment of transformation, a last act of faith captured in an object before the ability to perform it was lost. If that reading is correct, the pendant is both the dropped item from the boss fight and a kind of testimony, a prayer for mercy or understanding, made by a vicar who knew what was happening to her and chose to make it in the form of a material object that would outlast her in a recognizable shape. The Grand Cathedral where Amelia is fought is architecturally very different from the exterior of the cathedral ward, and this difference has been noted as potentially significant. The exterior of the area is Gothic and imposing, but inside the Grand Cathedral, the scale becomes even more extreme. The ceiling is unusually high, the stained glass windows are enormous, and the altar area where Amelia prays is proportioned in a way that suggests it was designed for someone much larger than a human. Some community readings have interpreted this as evidence that the Grand Cathedral was built with the eventual transformation of its occupants in mind, that the church knew its highest members would become beasts and designed the sacred space accordingly. The architecture outlasts the people who shaped it. The stained glass windows in the Grand Cathedral depict figures that have been analysed by community members who mapped the imagery to known Bloodborne characters and archetypes. Several of the windows contain images that seem to depict a figure with proportions consistent with a great one rather than a human. And one of the windows is commonly identified as depicting Ibrietas, the Great One, whose living form was stored in the altar space below the cathedral. If those identifications are correct, the church was publicly displaying images of the very beings whose influence was transforming its clergy, encoding them into the sacred architecture as objects of veneration. The church was worshipping what was consuming it. The transition from the cathedral ward to the forbidden forest that occurs after Amelia's defeat is gated by the information extracted from the gold pendant, specifically the prayer that contains the password for the gate. This sequence, where the player must speak the prayer aloud to advance, is unusual in Bloodborne and in From Software games generally. The game is asking you to perform the same act that Amelia's pendant records, to speak a prayer associated with the healing church. The player who progresses past this point has, in a small but specific sense, participated in the church's liturgy. You aren't just a hunter who killed a boss. You're someone who used what you found in her body to continue a ceremony she started. The specific body language of Amelia during the fight shifts as her health decreases in ways that reflect her increasing desperation. Early in the fight, her movements retain a kind of restrained, almost ceremonial quality. In later phases, as the beast fully takes over, the movements become less controlled and more purely animal. This gradient from controlled to chaotic is visible in her transition from upright combat to crawling, and the crawling phase specifically has been analysed as a callback to the movement style of other beast bosses in the game, suggesting that, in her most depleted state, Amelia's movement converges on a baseline beast behaviour that all transformed creatures share regardless of their original identity. The Witch of Hemwick encounter begins with a design that subverts the boss fight framework. There's initially only one visible witch, and the second only appears after you've been fighting for a period of time. This structure mirrors how the Witches of Hemwick operate in the lore, maintaining a false front and revealing their deeper resources only when pressed. The encounter design is a functional representation of the witch's actual behaviour. What you see at the start of the fight is not the full extent of what you're dealing with, and the witches are counting on that gap between apparent and actual threat. It's a boss fight that teaches you something about its subjects through the mechanics of fighting them. The Eye Collect enemies summoned by the Witches of Hemwick are a variant of eye enemies found throughout Yharnam in various forms, but their specific summoning in this context has lore implications. Eyes in Bloodborne are associated with insight, the capacity to perceive the higher reality that underlies the physical world. The witches are not summoning weapons or allies in the conventional sense. They are summoning the material representation of accumulated perception, the byproduct of having looked at too much truth for too long. The eyes are the consequence of their practice given physical form, and fighting the witches means fighting their collected knowledge, made manifest. Hemwick Charnel Lane is a path to the witches' arena that functions as an environmental record of their practice. A charnel lane is a place for the keeping of human remains, and the lane itself is exactly that, a corridor lined with the evidence of systematic body acquisition and processing. The specific interest the witches have in the dead, and particularly in the eyes of the dead, connects to the broader Bloodborne theme about what looking at the truth costs and what that cost produces over time. The witches have been harvesting insight from the deceased and using it to maintain their practice, which means the lane leading to their arena is a record of every person who contributed to their power without consenting to it. The Rune Workshop tool that the Witches of Hemwick drop is the item that unlocks the Carol rune system, and the connection between this item and these specific bosses is thematically consistent. Carol runes are described as transcriptions of sounds made by the Great Ones, a written language derived from listening to beings that human minds can barely process. The witches practice arcane arts derived from their contact with insight and with the material byproducts of observing the Great One's world. Their drop being the tool that opens up the rune system, places them as the gateway to one of the game's deeper customization layers, and frames that system as something that comes from practices as dark as what the witches were conducting. The visual design of the Witches of Hemwick is deliberately unspectacular relative to other Bloodborne bosses, and this is an intentional choice. They are two small elderly women in tattered robes rather than the enormous bestial horrors that most of the game's bosses represent. The unspectacular design makes them feel like they belong to a different tradition of horror, something older and quieter and potentially more dangerous, precisely because it doesn't announce itself the way a 12-foot monster does. The choice to make them visually understated emphasizes that the threat they represent isn't physical at all. It's cognitive. It's what happens when people know too much and use what they know without regard for what it costs. The fight against the Witches of Hemwick has a specific dynamic, where focusing on one witch exclusively causes the other to begin summoning eyes more aggressively. And this design creates a situation where splitting attention is not just tactically useful, but narratively appropriate. The witches have a collaborative practice, and their combat behavior reflects it. Removing one removes half of the collaboration, but the surviving half compensates. The design suggests that the witch's power is not simply additive, but genuinely collective, each sustaining the other in a way that the fight mechanics express through the aggression modifier when one is depleted. The location of the Witches of Hemwick fight across the bridge from Cathedral Ward places their arena in the part of Yharnam's geography that sits between the civic and ecclesiastical centres of the city and the more rural, less monitored outskirts. Hemwick is at the edge, geographically and institutionally, which is consistent with where practices like the witches would develop, on the margin of the city where the church's oversight was less comprehensive. The charnel lane that leads to them is literally at the edge of the area the game designates as Hemwick Charnel Lane, which places the witches as far from institutional oversight as the game's geography allows, while keeping them within Yharnam's orbit. The two witches don't acknowledge each other during the fight with any visible communication or coordination. They operate collaboratively without any apparent communication, which suggests a relationship that has moved beyond the need for explicit coordination. When two people have practiced together for long enough, their collaboration becomes automatic, and the witches' wordless tactical cooperation is a representation of a relationship that has been running for an enormous amount of time. They are synchronized in a way that only comes from extreme duration. Whatever the witches have been doing in Hemwick, they've been doing it together for long enough that they fight as a single organism expressed in two bodies. Martyr Ligarius is one of the most narratively rich optional bosses in Bloodborne, partly because his context requires the player to have found Cainhurst Castle, which itself requires a specific item and a deliberately non-obvious navigation choice. By the time you reach Ligarius, you've invested enough effort in getting there that the fight carries additional weight. His title, Martyr, is the church's recognition of his sacrifice, and sacrifice is the appropriate word. He chose to remain at Cainhurst for what appears to be centuries, guarding a queen he had already contained, because that was what the church required of him. He stayed. He kept staying, and something happened to him while he stayed. The weapon Ligarius wields, the Ligarius wheel, is available to the player through the old hunter's bone shop after the fight, and its description frames it as a punishment device that produces a kind of ritual friction against the flesh of heretics. The word heretic in this context refers specifically to the Vile Bloods, the blood-drinking aristocratic order associated with Queen Annalise, whom Ligarius was sent to contain. The weapon being a punishment device for heretics, wielded by the man sent to contain a heretical queen, makes the Ligarius fight a theological argument rendered in violent terms. He is not attacking the player because the player is a threat. He is attacking because anything that approaches Annalise's chamber is, by the logic of his centuries-long vigil, an agent of the heresy he was sent to suppress. The scythe that Logarius uses in the early phases of the fight draws from the folkloric association between scythes and death, but in Bloodborne's context, it also connects to the lunar imagery that runs through the game. The moon scythe appears in multiple cultural traditions and is connected to harvest, to cycles, and to the idea of death as something that can be presided over by a human figure. Placing this weapon in the hands of a church martyr who has outlived his natural lifespan by centuries of dedicated vigil creates a visual argument that the Church's conception of martyrdom involves a specific appropriation of death's iconography. Logarius doesn't just serve the Church, he has become something the Church imagined as sacred. The crown of illusions found on Logarius's body after the fight, and its function as a key to Annalise's chamber, raises questions about why Logarius had it at all. If he was the guard, why did he have the key? One reading is practical. As the designated guardian, he needed access to verify that his containment was still effective. Another reading is more troubling, that at some point in his long vigil, Logarius sought out Annalise, either to communicate with her or to offer or accept something. The crown being a wearable object he kept on his person rather than stored away suggests that whatever his relationship with the queen he was containing became over centuries. It was intimate enough that the key to her was always on his body. The rooftop setting for the Logarius fight is one of the most dramatically composed arenas in Bloodborne, and its visual design serves a purpose beyond spectacle. The elevation places Logarius literally above the castle he's been guarding, in a position that's simultaneously exposed and commanding. He's been up there at the highest point, watching everything below him for an enormous amount of time. The rooftop arena reads as his domain in a way that the castle interior does not. He's been outside on the roof for so long that the space has become his rather than belonging to the castle's original inhabitants. He is the highest point of Cainhurst. He has earned that position through duration alone. The magical abilities that Logarius demonstrates in the fight, including summoning skulls and deploying large-scale arcane attacks, reflect a level of healing church arcane training that places him among the most advanced practitioners shown in the game. The church's arcane tradition is described as something developed specifically in connection with the Great Ones, research at Byrgenwerth, and Logarius being trained in it to this level suggests he was not simply a zealot sent on a containment mission. He was a scholar, a trained practitioner of the Church's deepest arts, deployed specifically because the vile blood threat required someone with the full toolkit available. His centuries of vigil have given him time to develop those skills far beyond their original level. The celestial emissary boss fight is easy to underestimate because the creature is a larger version of the small blue enemies scattered throughout the research hall and Byrgenwerth environments. Most players have killed dozens of them as standard enemies by the time they reach the boss version, and the shift in scale from hazard to named boss is the encounter's primary dramatic move. But the ease with which players dismiss the emissary before the scale shift is itself meaningful. The creatures that would eventually produce a boss-level specimen were being treated as casual threats throughout the area, which reflects how the Healing Church's research program treated its subjects as material rather than as entities with their own significance. The celestial emissaries, as a category of being, are described in item descriptions as messengers or intermediaries from the celestial sphere, which in Bloodborne refers to the domain of the Great Ones. The Church's research hall and Byrgenwerth were both engaged in attempts to contact the Great Ones, and the emissaries appear to be the product of those attempts. Beings that exist in the space between human and celestial. The boss version of the emissary, being simply the largest and most developed specimen, suggests that the Church was cultivating these beings at scale, presumably hoping to use them as actual communication channels to the Great Ones. The experiment produced messengers. The messengers are currently trying to kill you. The church might still consider this a partial success. The arena for the celestial emissary fight, a small walled garden or rooftop space, is tonally distinctive from other boss arenas in the game. Where most Bloodborne boss fights occur in spaces that feel appropriate to the threat, the emissary fight happens in a relatively domestic, enclosed outdoor space, something between a garden and a courtyard. This doesn't match the scale of a significant boss fight, and the mismatch is part of the point. The celestial emissary is not a significant threat in the conventional sense. It's a consequence, a byproduct of research that was itself a byproduct of a larger institutional project. The garden setting suggests that this was a managed space, somewhere the emissaries were contained and tended before things went wrong. The specific moment during the celestial emissary fight, where the boss grows larger, is the encounter's single, most effective design move, and its placement, only after the player has comfortably fought a small blue blob for a while, is calibrated to produce a specific reaction. It's not a dramatic boss entrance, it's a gradual escalation that catches the player mid-fight, after they've already settled into a behavioural pattern for dealing with a small enemy. The sudden scale change is a mechanical representation of how the church's research projects worked. Contained and manageable right up until they weren't. Ebrietas, daughter of the cosmos, is found at the end of a sequence of encounters that passes through the most restricted area of the Healing Church's operations. The path to her involves navigating the choir's exclusive space and the altar of despair, and the progressive restriction of access as you approach her suggests that she was the church's most carefully guarded discovery. The word ebrietas in Latin means intoxication or drunkenness, and its application to a great one suggests a being that is saturated, overwhelmed, supersaturated with whatever substance the cosmos is made of. She is not just from the cosmos, she is drunk on it. The opening animation of Ebrietas's encounter is one of the most analysed moments in Bloodborne because it subverts every established expectation for boss introductions. Every other major boss either enters dramatically, is revealed by the environment, or is already actively engaged when the fight begins. Ebrietas is facing away from the player, prostrated before the altar when the arena is entered. She doesn't turn to face you immediately. The animation has her completing a gesture before she acknowledges the intrusion, and only then does she engage. Some readings interpret this as grief, Ebrietas mourning something or worshipping something in the space of the altar of despair. Others read it as a passive assertion of dominance, making the player wait on her terms. Both readings produce interesting implications. The connection between Ebrietas's opening posture and the prayer gesture performed by Vicar Amelia during that fight creates a cross-reference that rewards players who notice it. Amelia, a beast, performs a recognizable human prayer at an altar. Ebrietas, a great one, performs a gesture toward an altar that looks like prostration or worship. Both are found in spaces explicitly described as altars. Both perform devotional gestures. The implication is that the relationship between worship and the beings worshipped is more complicated in Bloodborne than standard religious logic would suggest. The Great Ones may be worshipping something above them in the same way the Church worships the Great Ones. The hierarchy continues upward in ways the game deliberately doesn't cap. The Altar of Despair's name, as a space associated with failed attempts to reach a higher state, raises the question of who experienced the despair. The Church researchers who worked here and failed to fully communicate with Ebrietas or Ebrietas herself, who was left behind when the other Great Ones withdrew or were lost. The description of Ebrietas in community analysis often returns to the idea that she is stranded, a being from a higher sphere who cannot return to it, left in a place humans built to approximate contact with her world. The Altar of Despair is named from her perspective as much as from theirs. She's been sitting in a room named after her own condition for a very long time. The damage type most effective against Ebrietas is Bolt, the same elemental type associated with Dark Beast Parl and with the Choir's research into celestial phenomena. This connection is not just a gameplay mechanic. It suggests that whatever Ebrietas is made of is specifically related to the electrical, celestial properties that the Choir was investigating, and that the research connecting Parl to the Choir and the research connecting the Choir to Ebrietas are part of the same program. The most effective weapon against the object of your research is the tool your research produced. Bolt was studied to understand the celestial. The celestial is vulnerable to Bolt. The Church was closer to understanding Ebrietas than they realized, or further away, depending on how you read the irony. The blood that Ebrietas produces when attacked is a specific visual variant compared to the blood produced by human or beast enemies. It has a quality described in community discussion as more viscous and differently coloured than typical blood, suggesting that whatever flows in her is not the same as the old blood used in church ministrations. She is not a source of the blood that the Church was using. She is something different, something that the Church's blood research was trying to approximate, but hadn't reached. The distance between what Ebrietas is and what the Church was doing with the old blood is the gap that all of Bloodborne's tragedy lives inside. Chapter 3: The Shadows and the Spider. The Shadow of Yharnam is a boss encounter that presents 3 distinct enemy entities rather than a single boss, and this structural choice is the most significant design decision of the fight before you even consider the lore content. Fighting 3 coordinated enemies requires a different cognitive approach from the player, and the specific coordination of the 3 shadows points toward the idea that they operate as a unit. The lore associated with the shadows suggests they are guardians of Yharnam's most secret history, specifically the existence of Byrgenwerth's connection to the Thumerian tombs, and the 3-body format suggests a tradition of distributed guardianship. 3 shadows, 3 aspects of a single secret. None of them sufficient on its own. The visual design of the Shadow of Yharnam enemies draws from Japanese masked theatre traditions, specifically the use of pale, expressionless masks over dark robes. This aesthetic choice is notable in a game whose general design palette draws from Victorian European Gothic rather than Asian theatrical traditions. The incongruity is likely intentional. The shadows represent something older and more esoteric than the Church's Victorian Gothic apparatus, and their design signals that they predate and exist outside the Church's aesthetic system. They look like they belong to a different time and a different place within the world's history, which is exactly what the lore implies about the knowledge they're guarding. The 3 shadows each carry a different weapon and use different abilities, one using a katana, one using flame, and one using snakes. The snake specifically is significant because serpents appear in Bloodborne's lore in connection with the formless Sweden and with the kind of contact with the Great Ones that produces frenzy outcomes. The shadow that summons snakes is not just a more dangerous enemy. It represents a specific kind of threat associated with a particular Great One's influence. The 3 shadows together cover blade, fire, and the arcane, physical, elemental, and cosmic. You are not just fighting guards, you are fighting a complete philosophy of protection rendered in 3 bodies. The location of the Shadow of Yharnam fight in the area beyond the Forbidden Woods that leads toward Byrgenwerth is associated in the game's geography with the path toward the knowledge the shadows are protecting. Everything in this area is overgrown and obscured, nature reclaiming the architectural evidence of what was done here. The shadows as an entity choosing to guard this specific access point suggests they have been there for a very long time, maintaining their vigil through the progressive encroachment of the forest. The forest itself might be read as an environmental extension of the concealment they practice. The path to Byrgenwerth is hidden by nature and guarded by things that wear that darkness as camouflage. The health pool of the three shadows combined is significantly higher than most single boss encounters at the same point in the game, and this disproportion is a common point of frustration among players experiencing the fight for the first time. But the combined health total is a mechanical representation of what the shadows represent: guardianship that has accumulated strength over time. Each shadow is individually manageable. All three together are overwhelming. The appropriate emotional register for this encounter is not frustration at the balancing, but recognition that the thing being guarded is important enough to require this level of protection. The difficulty is proportionate to the significance of the secret. The optional summons available before the Shadow of Yharnam fight include Henrik, a specific NPC whose presence here is often overlooked in favour of the Gascoigne-focused side quest. Henrik is an old hunter, one of the earliest of the hunter lineage in some readings, and his availability as a summon at this specific fight connects him to the sequence of knowledge the shadows are guarding. If Henrik knows enough to be here as a helper, his relationship with Byrgenwerth's secrets is more intimate than his surface characterization suggests. Old hunters in Bloodborne are consistently revealed to have deeper knowledge of the game's cosmic horror than their initial presentation implies, and Henrik's placement here is one of those quiet hints. The snake summoning ability of the third shadow in the fight produces serpents that behave with a specific animation that mirrors the snake enemies found in the Forbidden Woods area leading to this fight. This consistency in snake movement design across two distinct enemy categories, the wood snakes and the boss summoned snakes, suggests they share an origin or a controlling influence. The snakes in the woods and the snakes in the boss fight are likely both associated with the formless Uden's influence in this part of Yharnam's territory, and the continuity of their animation design is the game's visual language for that connection. The same thing is behind both sets of snakes. It's just wearing two different costumes. The fire attacks of the second shadow and the specific arc of the flame they produce are visually distinct from the flame attacks of other fire-using enemies in the game. The shadow's flame has a deeper, more saturated visual quality than the fire produced by Yharnam's torches or by other fire-using enemies, and community members have noted that this visual quality is closer to the flame associated with Lawrence and with the old Yharnam burning than to the conventional fire effects used elsewhere. If that visual distinction is intentional, it connects the shadow's fire to the historical burning of old Yharnam, suggesting a specific knowledge of that event, or a specific access to the kind of flame that was used then. The katana that the first shadow uses is one of the few explicitly Japanese-influenced weapons visible in a game whose general weaponry draws from European blacksmithing traditions. Its presence in the hands of a Japanese-masked guardian entity reinforces the aesthetic argument that the shadows belong to an older, pre-European tradition within the game's world history. The Thumerian civilization that the shadows are guarding knowledge of predates the European-coded Yharnam and its healing church, and the shadows' weapons and masks are coded as belonging to that pre-existing tradition. They are not Yharnam's creation, they predate it. The shadow creatures. The first shadow deploys as additional enemies during the fight have a visual design distinct from the shadows themselves, being darker, more amorphous, less defined. These shadow entities appear elsewhere in the game in association with specific arcane phenomena, and their presence here as subordinate to the shadows suggests a hierarchy within the arcane tradition the shadows represent. The shadows can summon and control entities that are themselves dangerous by any standard measure, which indicates a level of arcane power that exceeds what the fight's mid-game placement in the critical path might suggest. If you're treating this as just another boss encounter, you're not thinking about what you're actually fighting. Rom, the vacuous spider, is one of the more unusually named bosses in a game full of unusual names. Vacuous means lacking intelligence or lacking content, and applying it to Rom suggests either that Rom is not intelligent in the way the player might expect, or that Rom's role in the world is specifically associated with emptiness or absence. The community has generally settled on a reading where vacuous refers to Rom's specific function. She exists to create a veil of ignorance over a specific aspect of the cosmos, and being the agent of that ignorance, the keeper of a specific blindness, is why she is vacuous. She does not lack intelligence, she lacks the full picture deliberately as part of her cosmic function. The moonside lake where Rom is encountered is one of Bloodborne's most tonally distinct environments. After the claustrophobic architecture-dense areas that precede it, the lake opens up into a vast, flat, moonlit space that feels genuinely alien. The moon reflected in the perfectly still water creates a visual doubling. A real moon above and a reflected moon below, and fighting a massive spider creature in this environment, while the sky and the water mirror each other, suggests a space that exists at the intersection of two realities. Byrgenwerth, visible from the lake's edge, is where the research that created this space's significance began, and the lake feels like what that research eventually produced, a reflection of something real that isn't quite real itself. Rom's function in the lore is described in community analysis as actively suppressing the reality of Murgo's existence from the perceptions of ordinary Yharnam residents. The presence of the amygdala creatures on rooftops throughout Yharnam, visible only to players with sufficient insight, suggests that the world is overlaid with a hidden reality that Rom's existence keeps concealed from most people. Killing Rom lifts that concealment, which is why after her death the blood moon rises and the hidden world begins intruding more aggressively into the visible one. She was not just a boss in a lake, she was the mechanism that kept Yharnam from knowing what it was actually living inside. The small spider creatures that surround Rom during the fight are not there to damage the player in conventional terms. Their primary function is to interrupt your approach to Rom, and the visual of a massive passive spider creature surrounded by smaller spiders that defend it without active instruction is a specific image of maternal or colonial animal behavior. Rom does not direct the spiders, they simply orbit her. The relationship reads as biological rather than strategic, suggesting that whatever Rom is, she produces or attracts these creatures in the way that certain organisms produce satellite organisms. She is not commanding an army. She is a center of gravity. The fact that Rom doesn't actively attack during the early phases of the fight, simply sitting and absorbing damage while the small spiders respond, is consistent with her described function. She is a passive cosmic mechanism, not an active agent. She doesn't want to fight you. She doesn't want anything in the way that an active consciousness wants things. She maintains a state. She is vacuous in the way that a lens is vacuous. It doesn't contain the light it handles, it just shapes it. Attacking Rom is not engaging with an intelligence, it's disrupting a mechanism. And the mechanism's disruption has consequences that extend far beyond the arena. The meteor attack that Rom initiates when provoked is one of the most surprising moves in the game, partly because it comes from a creature whose visual design doesn't suggest ranged magical capability. Rom's body looks slow and passive. The meteors contradict that appearance entirely, and the contradiction is the point. Rom's passive exterior conceals an enormous capacity for damage, which is a functional representation of how the concealment she maintains works. The ignorance she enforces looks like nothing, but removing it, disturbing it, reveals the full violence of the hidden world it was containing. The meteors are what the ignorance looks like from the inside when you try to penetrate it. The moonside lake becoming accessible only after navigating Byrgenwerth's interior is a structural choice that frames the lake as the culmination of that institution's research. Byrgenwerth is where the research into the Great Ones began, and the lake is where that research's most significant product lives. The sequence, enter Byrgenwerth, absorb the outline of what happened, Find the shortcut to the lake, face Rom, is a compressed version of the entire arc of the church's involvement with the Great Ones. You go where it started, you confront the being that embodies the most dangerous consequence of that history. The lake is not just a boss arena, it's the endgame of an entire school of thought. The Moonside Lake does not exist in the same geographical logic as the rest of the game. Its scale relative to the surrounding architecture of Björkenwerth suggests that it cannot physically fit in the space the game's geography implies it occupies. This geographic impossibility is a detail that rewards players who think about the world as a space rather than just a level, and the most common interpretation is that the lake exists in a space adjacent to, or overlapping with, Yharnam's physical geography rather than literally within it. Rom's location in a space that doesn't fully obey the game's physical logic is consistent with her function as a being whose existence was specifically introduced by contact with a reality that follows different rules. Provost Willem, found at the edge of Moonside Lake in his transformed state after the Rom fight, is positioned in a way that rewards players who approach him carefully. He's facing the lake. He's not facing Björkenwerth behind him. He's looking at Rom's arena, at the space where his research's most significant consequence existed, and whatever he sees with the eyes that have grown across his body and hands is not something a human mind without that modification could perceive. He's been sitting there looking at something he made possible for what appears to be an enormous amount of time. Whether what he perceives is horror or something he considers insight is left entirely to the player's interpretation. The transition in Yharnam's sky from a regular full moon to the blood moon that occurs after Rom's death is one of the game's most significant environmental events, and its timing, immediately after the removal of the mechanism that was suppressing the hidden reality, is precise enough to read as causal rather than coincidental. The blood moon is not a consequence of the player's actions in a cause and effect combat sense. It's a consequence of what the player's actions removed. The concealment is gone. What was being concealed is now visible at a planetary scale. The sky changes because the sky was always this colour. Rom was just the reason you couldn't see it. The small spiders surrounding Rom, when examined closely in slow footage, have bodies that are slightly different from each other in subtle ways. They are not identical copies produced by a single animation file. Each one has minor variations in body proportions and limb length that suggest they were individually modelled within a range, rather than duplicated from a single source. This level of visual detail, applied to enemies that most players kill without looking at them closely, is characteristic of From Software's commitment to making the world feel inhabited rather than populated. Even the small enemies that exist to interrupt the player's approach to the real threat were given individual physical variation. The Moonside Lake area's ambient sound design is worth singling out as one of the most effective atmospheric audio tracks in the game. The sound of the lake itself is a specific combination of water ambience and a low tonal hum that sits just below conscious attention for most players, contributing to the sense of wrongness in the space without being identifiable as a discrete sound effect. Community audio engineers have analysed the tonal hum and described it as having a frequency relationship to the sound design used in areas associated with the Great One's influence, suggesting that the lake's ambience is coded in the same audio category as direct Great One contact. Standing in the Moonside Lake is not a neutral experience. The sound design is making sure you feel that. Chapter 4. The Nightmare's Architecture. The One Reborn is a boss that the community has consistently described as one of the more explicitly grotesque in Bloodborne, and that description is accurate in both visual and thematic terms. The creature is a massive agglomeration of human bodies fused into a single organism, which on a visual level is disturbing and on a lore level represents the endpoint of one of Bloodborne's recurring themes, the dissolution of individual identity into a collective body. The Church's use of blood ministrations was always a form of communal practice, distributing a shared substance to create a shared experience. The One Reborn is what it looks like when that communal sharing is taken to its logical extreme, and the boundaries between individual bodies are removed entirely. The arena for the One Reborn fight in Yharnam is surrounded by bell maidens on elevated platforms who continuously summon additional enemies into the fight. The bell maidens are not just a difficulty mechanic, they are a lore reference to the ringing of bells that appears throughout Bloodborne's imagery of the Great Ones and the Nightmare. The Nightmare is accessed through specific bell-ringing rituals, and the Bell Maiden's presence during the One Reborn fight frames the encounter as a ritual rather than just a combat event. You are not simply fighting a monster in Yharnam. You are fighting a monster at the center of an ongoing ceremony, and the ceremony is why the monster is there. The enemy types summoned during the One Reborn fight include Thumerians, enemies that elsewhere appear in the Chalice dungeons rather than in the main game areas. Their presence in Yharnam during this fight is a connection between the underground Thumerian world and the surface church operations, in a way that suggests Yharnam was specifically designed as a bridge between those two histories. The church gathered people in Yharnam because of what it was doing, and what it was doing involved both the Thumerian blood traditions and the newer research into the Great Ones. The One Reborn is the product of that combination, assembled in a place that was always meant to be where both histories converged. The visual of the One Reborn, cycling through attacks that use both human body components and more arcane projectile effects, suggests that the creature is not simply a biological amalgamation, but a combined entity that has retained the physical properties of its constituent parts, while gaining something additional from the fusion itself. The arcane capabilities it demonstrates are not present in any of the individual human enemies encountered in Yharnam or in the Chalice dungeons. The fusion produced something that the components alone could not have been. This is consistent with the Church's research goals, combining human and celestial properties into something that transcended both. The One Reborn is a success by a certain measure, not by any human measure. The death animation of the One Reborn is an unusually long collapse sequence relative to other bosses in the game, and this extended duration appears to be deliberate rather than simply a function of the creature's size. The collapse progresses in stages, first the central mass, then the peripheral components, then a final visual settling that seems to resolve the creature's form from a combined entity back toward individual components. This is the dissolution of the fusion, the One Reborn becoming many again in the moment of its death, which is a specific reversal of whatever process created it in the first place. The death animation is a lore statement about what the creature fundamentally is. Mikolash, host of the Nightmare, is one of the most discussed bosses in Bloodborne because of his dialogue. He talks throughout the fight, and what he says is some of the most directly lore-explanatory content in the game, but it's delivered in a context that makes it difficult to parse. He's running away from you while screaming fragments of philosophical monologue. The contrast between the chase mechanic and the content of the speech is deliberate. Mikolash is the host of a nightmare, not its master. He's been trapped in the nightmare of Mensis, for what the game implies is an extended period, and the running and the screaming are both products of prolonged exposure to a reality that human minds were not designed to inhabit. The line that Mikolash delivers most frequently in community discussion is his request for eyes on the inside, a phrase that appears in his item descriptions and his boss dialogue, and connects to the Bloodborne theme about insight and perception. Eyes in Bloodborne represent the capacity to perceive the Great One's reality, and eyes on the inside suggests a form of perception that doesn't require external sensory input, an internalized ability to see the hidden world without needing the physical world to mediate it. This is what Mensis was trying to achieve, and Mikolash's obsession with the phrase during the fight suggests that the nightmare has given him a version of it, an internal perception that's been active long enough to become the only way he knows how to see anything. The Mensis cage helmet that Micolash wears throughout the fight is explicitly described in its item text as a tool for contacting the Great Ones, by offering one's head as a vessel. The cage around the head is a literal architectural reference to making the skull an open container, a structure rather than a protected space. Micolash chose to wear this cage to present himself as a vessel for Great One contact, which is why he is now the host of the nightmare, rather than simply an inhabitant of it. He invited whatever is using him, and he has been hosting it for long enough that the invitation and the guest have become inseparable. The cage is still on his head because the cage was never the problem. What it let in was the chase sequence in the Micolash fight, where he runs into a mirror room and forces you to navigate around to a separate entrance, is one of the more conceptually interesting fight mechanics in Bloodborne. The mirror room specifically is an unusual piece of game architecture. Mirrors appear in folklore and psychological literature as thresholds between realities, spaces where the visible world has an imperfect double that follows different rules. A man who has been hosting a nightmare retreating into a room of mirrors is a visual argument about where he currently exists, in the reflection of reality rather than reality itself. You can't follow him directly through the glass. You have to go around. The two-phase structure of the Micolash fight, where the first half involves chasing him, and the second half is a contained encounter once you corner him, is a structural representation of how nightmare entities are encountered in the game's lore. The first approach is always indirect, always requiring you to navigate the nightmare's own logic. The direct confrontation only happens when that logic is exhausted or circumvented. Micolash in Phase 2, cornered and finally fighting rather than running, is Micolash at his most desperate, which is also Micolash at his most coherent. The direct fight is when you see him most clearly, and what you see is a man who went looking for the Great Ones and found something that could not be left or ended through any ordinary means. The specific Olga of Ebrietas ability that Micolash uses in the fight is the player available spell associated with the Ebrietas and with the choir's contact research. Its presence in Micolash's moveset connects him directly to the choir and to the research hall's work with Ebrietas, suggesting that Mensis and the choir were conducting parallel research programs into Great One contact that used some of the same methodologies. Micolash did not arrive at his nightmare independently. He followed a path that the Church's most advanced researchers had already charted, and the spell he uses against you is the evidence that he made it further down that path than most. The nightmare of Mensis as a space is a distorted reflection of specific Yharnam architectural elements, and the research hall and the unseen village are both visible in the geometry of the nightmare in altered forms. The nightmare preserves the physical environment of the research that created it, which is consistent with how Bloodborne's nightmares are described, as spaces shaped by the consciousness of those who inhabit them. Micolash has been shaping this nightmare for long enough that it reflects his specific history within the Church's research programs, and the architectural fragments that compose it are the material of his memory. Murgo's wet nurse is one of the most visually abstract bosses in Bloodborne, and this abstraction is appropriate to her narrative function. She is protecting Murgo, the Great One's child who exists in the nightmare of Mensis, and nothing about her appearance matches a recognizable reference point. She is a massive, robed entity with multiple arms and a face structure that doesn't correspond to any physiological logic human biology would produce. The abstraction is the point. She belongs to the nightmare in the same way that dream logic belongs to sleep. She only makes complete sense in the context of a reality that doesn't follow the rules of the waking world. Trying to understand her form by waking world standards is the wrong kind of thinking. The sound design of the Murgo's wet nurse fight includes a baby crying throughout the encounter, which is the presence of Murgo itself, audible but not visible, protected by the wet nurse's body. The baby cry persisting through the fight creates a specific emotional texture. You are fighting a caregiver to reach an infant, and the infant's presence as sound rather than form gives the encounter a quality of something that almost exists. Murgo is not quite there in any form that the game or the player can engage with directly. The sound is all that's accessible, and the wet nurse's function is to ensure that sound and the existence it represents remains protected from exactly the kind of thing that's currently attacking her. The multiple arms of Murgo's wet nurse and the way she deploys them in attack patterns that obscure and cover the space around her read as a protective behaviour as much as an offensive one. She is not simply attacking the player, she is maintaining a perimeter around Murgo. The attack patterns that make her difficult to engage are not optimised for damage, so much as for space control, keeping the player at a distance from the area where Murgo's presence is strongest. She is doing her job throughout the fight. Her job is to keep things away from what she's protecting, and the player character is exactly the category of thing she was placed here to keep away. The ending state of Murgo, after the wet nurse is defeated, where the baby crying stops and the game confirms that Murgo's life has faded, is one of the more unusual outcome descriptions in Bloodborne. Murgo dies not because the player kills it, but because its protector is removed. The baby's death is a consequence of losing its nurse, rather than a direct action by the player, which places the player in a morally ambiguous position relative to that death. You killed the caretaker, and the child's death followed. The game presents this as a necessary outcome of the hunt, rather than as a moral failure, but the language is careful. Murgo's life has faded rather than you killed Murgo. The distinction is small but specific. The wet nurse's teleportation ability, where she disappears and reappears in a different position, is accompanied by a specific visual effect that produces a brief darkness in the arena. This darkness during the wet nurse's teleport is the same visual effect used in other areas of the game to represent the intrusion of the nightmare's logic into physical space. The boss fight is technically taking place at the top of the Nightmare of Mensis's most significant architectural element, and the wet nurse's mobility through space is operating on nightmare rules rather than physical ones. She doesn't move through the space, she moves through the nightmare that the space exists within. The design of the wet nurse's robe, which is one of the more extensively analysed visual elements in the game, contains specific detail in the fabric's folds that community members have identified as depicting additional faces. These faces in the fabric folds are not large or obvious, and they require high-resolution footage and deliberate searching to confirm. If intentional, the additional faces in her clothing suggest that the wet nurse is not a single entity, but a composite or a representation of multiple protective presences, the same kind of collective identity logic that produces the one reborn, but applied here to a guardian function. She is many nurturing presences combined into one protective form. That interpretation makes the baby crying through the fight even more specific. Whatever Murgo is, it has been surrounded by protection at a scale that the visible single form of the wet nurse only partially represents. Chapter 5. Yharnam and the End of All Hunts. Yharnam, the first hunter, is the most narrative-dense boss in Bloodborne's main game, and everything about the encounter communicates his history and his relationship to the player before a single word of his dialogue is delivered. He's found in the hunter's dream, a space that the player has been using as a safe haven for the entire game, in the workshop area that has always felt like the benign centre of the dream. His transformation from kindly mentor figure to final boss occupies a small physical distance in the game's geography, and that proximity is the point. The threat was always here. The mentor was always the final obstacle. The dream was always the mechanism The burial blade that Gehrman wields in the boss fight is described in its item text as the first weapon created specifically for the hunt, the original tool from which the game's entire combat tradition is derived. Fighting Gehrman with the burial blade in his hands means fighting him with the weapon he invented, in the space he created, under the conditions he established. Every advantage the game's combat system gave the player over the course of the run was derived from Gehrman's original framework. He taught the world how to hunt, and the final hunt is against him. There's a recursion to the encounter that the item description of his weapon makes explicit if you read it before the fight. The flower field where Gehrman is first encountered, sitting in his wheelchair among the pale flowers, is associated in community analysis with the flowers found on graves throughout Yharnam. The flowers in the dream are commonly identified as a specific variety whose real-world counterpart is used in funerary practices in European traditions, which would make the flower field in the hunter's dream a funerary garden, a space for the dead. Gehrman has been in the dream, caring for dead hunters and facilitating hunts that end in death for an extended period, and the garden he tends is visually identified as a garden for the dead. He is not the caretaker of a paradise. He is the groundskeeper of a cemetery for people who can't rest. The three ending options in Bloodborne are all resolved through the Gehrman encounter, and each ending begins with the same dialogue, where Gehrman offers the player release. This offer, which appears to be genuinely made in the context of Gehrman's desire to free the player from the dream rather than continue it, reads as the most sincere thing Gehrman does in the game. He wants to end the hunt. The moon presence won't let him end his own, but he can end yours, and the offer he makes is the closest thing to mercy that the dream's most experienced prisoner can provide. Whether the player accepts or refuses, the sincerity of the offer is Gehrman at his most human. The Lady Maria connection to Gehrman is established through item descriptions rather than through direct interaction, and it's one of the most emotionally resonant Easter eggs in the main game. The doll in the hunter's dream, the player's primary interactive resource in the dream space, was modelled after Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower, a hunter who was Gehrman's student. Gehrman created the doll after Maria died or left, and the presence of the doll in his dream is a record of his loss and his inability to process it. He has been living in a space structured around a replica of someone he cared for and lost, for long enough that the replica has become more real to him than the original. The dream is not just a prison, it's a monument to grief. Gehrman's wheelchair is a detail that raises questions the game doesn't answer directly. He is physically capable of standing and fighting in the boss encounter, which means the wheelchair is not a strict medical necessity. The chair represents something other than physical limitation. It represents a choice not to stand, a posture of waiting and receiving that is appropriate to his role as the steward of the dream. He sits because sitting is how you receive and process what hunters bring back. Standing, fighting, moving under your own power is what you do when you're hunting. The wheelchair is the costume of his non-hunting role. Taking it off in the boss fight is the moment when Gehrman stops being the steward and becomes a hunter again, for the last time. The boss music for the Gehrman fight is specifically composed with an elegiac quality that differs from the tension-building music of every other boss in the game. It's not triumphant, it's mournful. The music holds two emotional registers simultaneously: the urgency of combat and a deep sadness that the combat needs to happen at all. This tonal choice communicates something that Gehrman's dialogue alone doesn't fully convey: that this fight is a loss for everyone involved, that there is no version of this encounter where the outcome is unambiguously good. The music knows that. It's the most honest commentary on the situation available in the boss fight. Gehrman's scythe moveset in the fight is notably different from the moveset available to the player when using the burial blade as a player-wielded weapon. The version Yharnam uses has sweeping attacks that cover far more area and carry a different visual weight than the player-available version. And this discrepancy has been noted as suggesting that what the player receives after the fight is not exactly what Yharnam wields, but a standardized version of it. The weapon the game hands you is a tool derived from the original. The original is what Yharnam himself carries, shaped over decades of use into something that fits him specifically. You get the design. He has the thing itself. The transition from Yharnam to the Moon Presence, which occurs in the ending where the player refuses Yharnam's offer and defeats him, is one of the most cinematically effective moments in the game. The appearance of the Moon Presence over the flower field, descending to consume Yharnam's body, and then turning toward the player, reconfigures every safe space the player has occupied during the game. The dream was always a trap. The moon visible throughout the game was always this entity. The flowers in the garden were always the flowers of this particular funerary context. The Moon Presence descending is the game finishing a sentence it's been building since the opening cinematic, and the reveal is effective because every piece of it was already visible to players who knew how to look. The Moon Presence's visual design is one of the most abstract boss designs in the game. A spindly, radially symmetrical figure with tentacles and a face structure that suggests something simultaneously eyeless and all-seeing. The design draws from cosmic horror in the specific sense of being a being whose form defies the bilateral symmetry that most complex life on Earth follows. It does not look like something that evolved in the same physical context as the creatures it has been manipulating. It looks like something from a place where the rules of biology followed a different starting set of conditions. Everything about its design says this did not come from here. The Moon Presence fight, and specifically its ability to apply frenzy and reduce the player's health, reads as a representation of the effect that direct contact with a Great One has on human minds and bodies. The frenzy mechanic throughout Bloodborne is associated with perceiving too much of the hidden reality at once. The Moon Presence in direct combat is essentially forcing the player into the most extreme version of that experience, making the fight an embodied argument about why the Moon Presence needed to exist at a remove from human consciousness, rather than in direct contact with it. The dream was the buffer. Without it, the contact is this. The ending that results from defeating the Moon Presence, where the player character becomes an infant Great One, is the outcome that requires the most preparation and represents the most complete engagement with the game's lore. Consuming 3 umbilical cords and surviving the Moon Presence's direct contact produces a transformation that mirrors in some sense what happened to the scholars at Björgenwerth, the hunters in the nightmare, and the researchers in the choir. The difference is that where they were destroyed or consumed by their attempts at contact, the player character undergoes something more complete. Not a failed attempt at ascension, but an actual one. The Great One that emerges at the end is what everyone in the game was trying to become. The 3 umbilical cords required for the true ending are associated with 3 different Great One adjacent events in the game's history: Murgo's existence, the Pale Blood research, and the one left by Iosefka, or the abandoned old workshop. Each cord is a material record of a specific moment when human and Great One biology intersected. Consuming all 3 and then defeating the Moon Presence is the culmination of every thread the game has been running, resolved not through victory over a monster, but through a transformation that makes the question of victory irrelevant. You don't defeat the cosmic horror. You become something that the cosmic horror can't contain. The Yharnam fight includes a specific gravity manipulation move where Yharnam lifts the player into the air before slamming them down, and this move has been analysed as a reference to the way the Moon Presence itself interacts with the physical world. Yharnam, who's been in the Moon Presence's dream for an extended period, appears to have absorbed some of its properties, including the ability to manipulate gravity in a limited way. This would mean that the fight against Yharnam is, in a small sense, a preview of the Moon Presence fight that follows if the player refuses his offer. You're already fighting something that carries a trace of the Moon Presence before you're fighting the Moon Presence itself. The doll's reaction to Yharnam's defeat is one of the more understated moments in Bloodborne's narrative. She doesn't celebrate, she doesn't express relief. She acknowledges what happened with a quiet acceptance that reads as appropriate for a being who was created to serve a function in a dream that was always going to end this way. The doll knows what she is. She knows what Yharnam was. She knows what the dream is. Her reaction to the fight's conclusion is the reaction of someone who has always known the shape of the story and was simply waiting for it to arrive at this particular point. There's nothing comforting about her calm. It's just the calm of something that was always expecting this. The flower fields visual in the Moon Presence ending, where the player character lies among the pale funerary flowers and is presumably consumed or transformed before the Great One, infant, emerges, closes a visual loop that began with the opening cinematic. The game opens with a hand reaching across a floor in candlelight. It ends with a form lying in a flower field under the blood moon. The player's entire journey through Yharnam is contained between those two images, and the flower field, as a resting place, is the funerary garden serving its intended function at last. Whatever lies down in those flowers doesn't get up as the same thing that entered the dream. Chapter 6. The Old Hunters, Ludwig and Lawrence. Ludwig, the Accursed, is the first boss of the Old Hunters DLC, and is encountered in a form that requires context to fully understand. What the player initially encounters is a massive, horrifying beast without any indication of who this creature was. It's only in the second phase of the fight, after the beam of light from Simon the Harrowed illuminates it, that Ludwig's human consciousness briefly surfaces, and in that moment the creature becomes recognizable as someone who was once a person, not just a monster. This structure, beast first then person, inverts the usual Bloodborne revelation sequence, where you learn who someone is before their tragedy. With Ludwig, the tragedy comes before the identity. You kill most of him before you know him at all. The Holy Moonlight Sword that Ludwig drops is one of the most narratively significant item drops in the game, and its description frames it as a weapon that Ludwig cherished during his life as a hunter, something he held onto as a connection to his humanity, even through his transformation. The sword retains its power despite everything its owner became, and wielding it as the player means carrying a piece of Ludwig's original self into combat situations he never survived. The weapon that outlasted its wielder's humanity is available to the player after his death, which is Bloodborne's specific way of allowing the dead to continue acting through what they leave behind. Ludwig's dialogue during the second phase of the fight, when his human consciousness briefly surfaces, centers on his desire to know whether the hunters he trained carried on in the right way. He asks about the students, whether they were good hunters. The specific word used across the fight's different language versions consistently references honor, dignity, or an equivalent concept. He wants to know if his line of hunters kept their integrity. This is a question that the game, considering the state of Yharnam and the state of the hunt by the time the player arrives, cannot be answered affirmatively. The hunt that Ludwig helped establish became the hunt that ended in the events of the game. His students became Gascoigne, Henrik, and the corrupted hunters who attacked the player throughout central Yharnam. The relationship between Ludwig and the Healing Church is one of the DLC's more carefully constructed revelations. Ludwig was a lay hunter before the church developed its own, more advanced hunters, and his approach to the hunt was more practical and less ecclesiastically informed than the hunters the church later trained. The friction between Ludwig's tradition and the church's was not simply a difference in technique, it was a difference in the understanding of what the hunt was for. Ludwig hunted beasts. The church hunted for different reasons, including the acquisition of knowledge and the maintenance of power. The DLC places the player in the nightmare as a space where both traditions' consequences are visible simultaneously. The specific arena where Ludwig is fought, a pit filled with the accumulated bodies of dead horses and their riders, is one of the most visually specific environments in the DLC. Ludwig reportedly used horses in his hunting methods, an unusual detail for Bloodborne, which generally focuses on individual hunters on foot. The presence of horse corpses in his arena suggests that the creatures he used in his hunting were also destroyed by whatever process claimed Ludwig himself. The visual of dead horses piled in a space where Ludwig now exists as a beast is an archaeological record of his history. The ruins of his methodology surround him. The sound design of the Ludwig fight changes significantly between his two phases in ways that mirror the visual transformation. The first phase has a sound design built around heavy biological impacts, wet sounds, and animal vocalizations. The second phase, after his human consciousness surfaces and he takes up the Holy Moonlight Sword, has a sound design that introduces musical elements, specifically a melodic quality to the weapon's larger attacks that's absent from the first phase's purely aggressive audio palette. The introduction of melody into the combat sounds, in the phase where Ludwig is most himself, is the audio representation of what that consciousness restoration sounds like. He finds music when he finds himself. Ludwig's first phase has attack patterns that are specifically less readable than his second phase, which is an unusual design choice given that games typically make later phases harder to read as the fight escalates. The interpretability inversion in Ludwig's fight, where the beast phase is more chaotic and the human phase is more structured and rhythmic, is a design statement about what humanity means in the context of a beast transformation. The beast is chaos, the person is pattern. When Ludwig's humanity returns, even briefly, the fight becomes more coherent, which means it also becomes more engaging as a combat encounter. You fight better against the person than against the beast. The fight is designed to make you notice that. The connection between Ludwig and the Healing Church's early development is suggested through the Ludwig's Holy Blade weapon, available in the main game, which is named after him and designed in a tradition that predates the Church's more arcane weaponry. The weapon named after him is a straightforward, powerful greatsword without the trick weapon complexity of the game's more advanced designs, which reflects Ludwig's practical, less institutionally sophisticated approach to the hunt. He gave his name to the simplest and most direct of weapons. The weapons that came after him are more complex. That complexity cost more than the Church admitted. Lawrence, the first vicar, is found in the DLC as a boss, but is described throughout the item descriptions of the main game as one of the most important figures in the Church's history. He was the first person to hold the title of vicar, the highest position in the Church's hierarchy, and the description of his role suggests he was instrumental in establishing the Church's relationship with the blood and with Byrgenwerth. The fact that you encounter him in the DLC as a beast version that mirrors Vicar Amelia in the main game suggests that the first vicar and the last vicar share the same fate. The office that began with Lawrence's transformation ends with Amelia's. The Church's history is bracketed by the same curse. The skull that appears in the main game at the altar of Amygdala, the item called Lawrence's Skull, is a preview of the DLC encounter that most players encounter before they fight the actual boss. The skull is described as belonging to Lawrence and as containing memories or residual consciousness, and the visual of a Healing Church vicar having been reduced to a skull available as a collectible item before you even know the DLC exists, is characteristic of Bloodborne's approach to revealing consequences before their causes. You find the skull. You find the skull's story later. The ordering feels deliberate. Encounter the end before the beginning, so that when you eventually fight Lawrence, you already know what he becomes. the fire attacks that Lawrence uses in his beast form, specifically the ability to melt the stone floor of the arena into molten material that persists as a hazard, have a connection to the burning of Old Yharnam. Lawrence is described in some community analysis as potentially having ordered or sanctioned the burning of Old Yharnam as a response to the beast plague, and his boss form dealing fire damage in a way that literally alters the landscape of the arena, creates a visual connection between his personal capacity for destruction and the historical destruction associated with his institutional decisions. He burned a part of his city. His beast form burns everything around it. The fire is not just a damage type, it's his history made physical. The fight against Lawrence has a specific phase where he loses his lower body and drags himself across the arena floor using his arms, which is one of the more viscerally disturbing boss animations in the DLC. The physical specificity of a creature that once held the highest office in the healing church being reduced to dragging itself across the floor by its fingertips is a visual argument about institutional ambition and its consequences that requires no caption. He reached for everything the church could offer and became this. The contrast between the title First Vicar and the crawling, burning beast is the contrast the game wants you to sit with during that phase. The connection between Lawrence and Provost Willem, suggested through the lore as a foundational relationship for everything that followed, is a division of a single project into two trajectories. Willem was a scholar of the Great Ones who prioritized accumulated knowledge. Lawrence was his colleague who took the knowledge from Byrgenwerth and institutionalized it into the healing church. Their division, when it occurred, was over the question of what the knowledge should be used for. Willem wanted understanding. Lawrence wanted application. The consequences of application are the entire history of Yharnam. The consequences of understanding are visible in the strange transformed form of Willem himself, seated at the edge of Moonside Lake. Both men chose wrong. They chose wrong in different directions. The Lawrence's skull item in the main game, when used, plays a brief audio fragment that some community members have analysed as containing a reversed speech component, similar to the audio details found in the cleric beast's vocalization. If this audio detail is present and deliberate, it would connect Lawrence to the same category of audio design used for transformed church members, suggesting that the skull retains something of the transformation process, even in isolation from the body. The skull is not just a key item or a lore artifact. It contains a record of what happened to the person it belonged to, encoded in its audio signature. Bloodborne puts things where you might not think to look for them. The timing of the Lawrence boss fight within the DLC's critical path places it after Ludwig, and after the player has already encountered the research hall and understood the scope of what the church was doing there. By the time you fight Lawrence, you've seen the consequences of his institutional decisions across multiple encounters and environments. The fight is not an introduction to Lawrence, it's a conclusion to a long series of evidence. You've been building a case throughout the DLC, and Lawrence is the final exhibit. The fight lands differently when you've already understood who he was before you see what he became. The specific item drops from Lawrence, including the Lawrence's skull, which initiates a brief narrative flashback. Connect the drop mechanic to the game's broader practice of encoding lore in items rather than in dialogue or text screens. Killing Lawrence produces a material object that contains his history, which is how Bloodborne treats almost all of its significant lore revelations. The information is always in the item. You have to pick it up, equip it, read it, and often cross-reference it with 3 other item descriptions before the full picture emerges. Lawrence's skull is the most literally named example of this mechanic. The boss drops his head, and his head contains the story. Chapter 7. Lady Maria and the Living Failures. Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower is widely considered the most technically accomplished boss in Bloodborne, and the design of her fight reflects her specific history in ways that reward engagement with the DLC's broader narrative. Maria was a hunter trained by Yharnam, a distant relative of Queen Annalise of Cainhurst, who left that aristocratic legacy behind to become a practical hunter. Her specific choice to abandon that heritage, and later her choice to take her own life and be buried in the research hall rather than continue participating in the atrocities committed at the fishing hamlet, are both visible in how the fight develops. She is always a person making choices, even in death. The rakuyo, Maria's weapon, is described as a weapon she shared with a hunter she partnered with, and its paired design, two blades that separate and rejoin, reflects a relationship that existed between its two users before they were separated. Maria fought with this weapon until she threw it into a well and refused to continue, which is the specific act of rejection that her story centers on. The weapon appearing in the DLC as the reward at the bottom of a well, available for the player to retrieve, is the game presenting a choice. You can pick up what Maria put down, or you can leave it there. Most players take it. The game doesn't comment on that. The three phases of the Maria fight correspond to three stages of escalating willingness to engage. In the first phase, she fights with pure technique. No blood, no arcane power, just the skills of a trained hunter. In the second phase, she reopens wounds on her hands to fuel blood-based attacks, a reference to the Cainhurst vile blood tradition of using one's own blood as a weapon, a heritage she rejected, but which is part of her body's vocabulary. In the third phase, she ignites the blood with fire and ash, achieving something that looks like transcendence or transformation. Each phase is a capitulation. She fights clean, then she uses what she was born with. Then she burns herself to reach something beyond both. The astral clock tower where Maria is fought is one of Bloodborne's most architecturally distinctive environments, and its presence in the research hall nightmare reflects the specific history of the building. The research hall was where the church conducted experiments on fishing hamlet survivors, and the nightmare version preserves the building's essential function while distorting its geometry. The clock tower component, rising above the research spaces, is where Maria's residual consciousness is contained. She occupies the highest point, the place with the greatest visibility, and what she can see from there is everything that happened in the space below her. She's been watching from up there for a very long time. The portrait of Lady Maria found in the research hall area of the DLC is one of the more significant visual Easter eggs in the game because of its composition. The portrait shows Maria before her transformation, before the fishing hamlet, before the decisions that define her story's end. The painting is positioned in the research hall in a way that requires the player to find it deliberately, and it's the only visual record of what Maria looked like as a living person engaged in regular life, rather than at the end of a tragic arc. The portrait and the boss fight exist as visual bookends. Here is who she was before, and there is what she became after. The transition between Maria's second and third phases includes a specific audio event where a sound plays that community members have analysed as structurally similar to the sound used for the Great One's screams in other parts of the game. This would suggest that Maria's transformation into the third phase is not simply a physical escalation, but something closer to a moment of contact or resonance with the Great One's sphere. Her blood igniting is not simply a mechanical phase change. It's the blood doing something that blood with enough accumulated history can do when pushed past a certain point. The Cainhurst bloodline's connection to the Great Ones runs through her veins, and the third phase is where that connection becomes audible. Maria's opening stance when the player enters the arena is a specific ready position that differs from the idle stances of every other humanoid boss in Bloodborne. She stands with her weapon held in a posture that looks like it's been practiced for a very long time, and the specificity of the stance suggests that Maria is someone for whom combat preparedness is not a state she enters, but a state she maintains. She was ready before you got there. She's been ready for however long she's been in this nightmare, maintaining a preparedness for a confrontation she knew was eventually coming. The stance is her version of Gehrman's wheelchair, the costume of a role she never stopped occupying. The living failures are one of the more conceptually sad boss encounters in the DLC, and their name contains the entirety of their lore in 2 words. The Church's research programs involved attempts to contact the Great Ones through human subjects, and the living failures are the people who survived those attempts in forms that were neither fully human nor fully successful transformations. They are alive in a technical sense. They are failures in every other sense. The group boss format of the encounter, where you face a crowd of these beings rather than a single entity, reflects the scale of the research program that produced them. This is not one failed experiment, but dozens. The moon that appears during the living failures encounter, rising and falling as the fight progresses, is directly connected to the fight mechanic in ways that suggest the failures are drawing power from the lunar cycles that the Great Ones are associated with. Their ability to channel the moon's energy during the fight is a remnant of the partial contact they achieved before their transformations failed. They couldn't complete the contact. They retained a trace of it. And that trace, the residual connection to the celestial, is what makes them dangerous despite their incomplete state. The moon in their fight is not background. It's what they have left of what they were reaching for. The terrain of the living failures arena is a botanical garden on an elevated platform of the research hall, and the incongruity of a beautiful cultivated garden space being the location for a fight against a crowd of failed experiments is characteristic of Bloodborne's approach to irony through environmental design. The garden suggests care and cultivation and growth. The failed experiments suggest exactly the opposite. The combination of these visual registers in a single space produces the specific Bloodborne dissonance, where the most beautiful spaces are where the worst things happened, and the most manicured environments are where something was systematically destroyed. The specific spell effects that the living failures use, reaching toward the moon and channeling energy downward, look almost like supplication or prayer. They are performing a gesture of reaching upward towards something above them, which is exactly what the research program that created them was designed to do. They were meant to reach the Great Ones. They reach and reach throughout the fight, and what comes down is not contact or enlightenment, but destructive celestial energy. They are still trying to do the thing they were made to do. They will never succeed. They will never stop trying. The visual design of the living failures reflects a specific stage of incomplete transformation that's distinct from the beast transformation visible in the main game's beast bosses. The failures are not beasts. They are something else, something that was trying to become celestial and got stuck part way. Their bodies show the elongation and distortion associated with contact with Great Ones, similar to what's visible in Provost Willem's transformed form, but without the completion that those other transformations suggest. The failures stopped somewhere in the middle. The research that produced them stopped before they reached what they were aimed at. The item description for the living failures identifies them as products of the choir's experiments and frames their current state as a consequence of having been too close to the celestial material without adequate preparation. The choir sent people to approach the Great Ones without giving them the tools to survive the approach intact, which is the Church's research program in miniature. Pursuing a goal without adequately considering what the pursuit would cost the people used to pursue it. The living failures are not just experimental subjects. They are a record of the choir's negligence, expressed in biological terms. The environment of the research hall, accessible through the DLC, contains a specific horror that compounds what the living failures reveal about the Church's practices. The hall itself is full of patients still constrained in their positions, some alive, some not, all subjected to procedures that the church considered research. The living failures are the ones who are taken further into the process. The patients in the research hall are the ones who are stopped at an earlier stage. The two groups together constitute a spectrum of what the church's human subject research produced. Partial failures and more complete failures, arranged in the same building, all under the same institutional program. Chapter 8. The Orphan of Kos. The Orphan of Kos is the final boss of the Old Hunters DLC and is located at the end of the fishing hamlet, an area that reveals one of the most significant backstory events in Bloodborne. The fishing hamlet was home to a coastal community that was in proximity to the Great One Kos when she beached herself on their shore. The healing church descended on the hamlet to study Kos and her inhabitants, conducting experiments on the villagers and eventually stripping Kos of the material they needed for their research. The fishing hamlet curse, which traps the old hunters in a nightmare, was the response of Kos's spirit to what was done there. The orphan is the physical consequence of everything that was taken. The orphan emerges from the dead body of Kos at the start of the fight, which is one of the most significant pieces of staging in the entire game. Kos is already dead on the beach, a massive, humanoid sea creature whose form is only partially visible above the waterline. The orphan tearing itself free from her corpse is a birth sequence that's also an extraction scene, which frames the creature's entrance as simultaneously the beginning of a new entity and the final violation of something that was already destroyed. The church took from Kos in life, and in death, what remains of her still contains something that can emerge. The orphan did not choose to exist. It was left inside something that was torn apart, and it came out into a world that had already decided what everything around it was worth. The weapon the orphan uses, the placenta of Kos, is the most unusual boss weapon in Bloodborne, and possibly in the From Software catalogue. It's a biological object, the material that connected Kos to the being she was gestating, and using it as a weapon is the orphan weaponizing the connection between itself and its parent. The placenta in human and animal biology is the interface organ between mother and child, and the orphan using it as a flail is a specific image of a child that never had a nurturing connection with its parent, using the severed remnant of that potential connection as a means of destruction. It's a detail that's disturbing on multiple levels simultaneously. The scream that the orphan releases at the start of the fight is widely considered the most memorable audio event in Bloodborne, and is frequently cited in discussions about effective sound design in video games. The scream is a genuine baby cry, but processed and amplified and layered into something that transcends any individual sound in a way that communicates anguish at a physical level. Players who encounter it without prior knowledge describe it as unexpected and deeply unpleasant in a way that goes beyond the normal parameters of video game boss sounds. It is the sound of something that has just come into existence in conditions that no being should exist in, and it is placed at the start of a fight that the player is about to win. The structure is deliberate and uncomfortably effective. The lightning attacks of the orphan in its second phase connect it to the pattern of bolt damage that runs through the game's celestial entities. Kos is a great one from the sea, and the association of oceanic beings with electrical properties is consistent with real atmospheric phenomena associated with the ocean. The orphan, drawing on lightning in its most desperate phase, is reaching for the power that came with being connected to Kos, power that Kos herself might have wielded. It's one of the few moments in the fight where the orphan does something that looks less like grief and anger and more like trying to access something it was born with, but can't fully command. The lightning is inheritance. It's just being used badly. The second phase of the orphan fight begins with the creature throwing its discarded placenta into the sea, and the impact producing an explosion, which is a transition moment that community members have analysed as a rejection of the connection to Kos rather than simply a dramatic phase change. The orphan, in the second phase, is fighting without the remnant of its parent. It has thrown away the last physical connection to the being it was extracted from and is now fighting on its own terms, with its own body. This reading makes the second phase harder to emotionally navigate. The thing you're fighting is not the grieving child anymore. It's something that has decided it's on its own and acted on that decision. The nightmare of the fishing hamlet exists as a space where the people victimized in the original event are preserved in an eternal nightmare state, attacking the player as enemies throughout the area. The fishermen and villagers of the fishing hamlet, who were experimented on by the old hunters and by the church's researchers, are still there in the nightmare, still defending the hamlet, still trying to drive off invaders who came for Koz. The player character entering the nightmare is, from the perspective of those villagers, exactly the same category of entity as the hunters who destroyed their home. You are not a hero arriving at the fishing hamlet. You are another hunter, and the nightmare's inhabitants respond accordingly. The curse associated with Koz, referenced in the prayer that appears in the item descriptions and in the environmental lore of the fishing hamlet, is one of the game's most direct acknowledgements that the church and its hunters were not simply fighting against chaos and beasthood. They were perpetrating specific violence against specific communities, and the consequences of that violence are the nightmare the DLC takes place in. The old hunters are trapped in the fishing hamlet nightmare because of what they did there. The orphan exists because of what was done to Koz. The curse is not a supernatural affliction imposed from outside. It's the natural consequence of what was taken by force from something that deserved to be left alone. The fishing hamlet's geography, with the enormous form of Koz beached on the shoreline, establishes the scale of what the church encountered here. Koz is visually massive, extending far into the water, and her presence on the beach would have been impossible for the hamlet's residents to ignore or to contextualize within any framework they had available. The community that lived here had their entire world redefined by what appeared on their shore, and the church's arrival to study and extract from Koz added a secondary definition that was entirely beyond their ability to resist or respond to. The fishing hamlet was overwhelmed by events in a way that the game's other locations weren't. It happened twice, and both times from the sea. The Koz parasite, available as a player weapon in the DLC, is described as a remnant of Koz herself that was extracted during the church's research and that retains her properties in a diminished form. Its availability to the player as a weapon makes the player character, in the DLC's context, another entity extracting something from Koz's remains for their own use. Whether that usage is framed as respectful or extractive depends on how the player chooses to think about it. But the game's placement of a Koz-derived weapon in the same DLC that condemns the church's extraction of material from Koz is a quiet challenge to any reading of the player character as purely heroic. You're doing what the church did, you just have a different justification. The body of Koz, even in death, is animated by subtle movements in the water and in the material that composes her form. She's not simply a static prop in the arena. Her form shifts and settles in ways that distinguish it from the inert architecture of the area. And this subtle animation has been noted by community members who captured footage of the arena in between fight phases. Koz moves after death. Whatever presence remains in her body, whether it's the parasite, the orphan's connection to her, or something else, persists in the form of the very small physical movements that a static body wouldn't produce. She's not entirely gone. Something remains. The orphan can feel it. The shoreline arena for the Orphan of Koz fight is one of the largest boss arenas in the game, and its scale is appropriate to a fight that represents the culmination of an entire DLC's narrative arc. The openness of the shoreline, with the ocean behind the orphan and the hamlet ruins behind the player, frames the encounter as taking place at a boundary between the sea that Koz came from and the land where the humans who destroyed her lived. The orphan is positioned on the beach, the same beach where everything began, and fighting it there places the player in the exact space where the original harm occurred. The geography is the history. You're fighting in the crime scene. The animation detail of the orphan's first attack, after emerging from Kos, which is a frantic, swinging strike rather than a measured opener, is consistent with the behavior of a creature that has just experienced birth trauma rather than a creature that's been waiting in a combat-ready state. The first attack is not controlled. It's the movement of something that just came into existence in conditions that don't allow for measured responses. The fight starts in the middle of the creature's distress rather than at its beginning, which is an unusual structural choice for an opening boss attack, and one that frames the entire encounter from the orphan's emotional register rather than the player's combat register. Chapter 9. The Chalice Dungeons and Their Secrets. The Chalice Dungeons are procedurally generated dungeon systems in Bloodborne that contain their own set of bosses, many of which are variants of main game bosses, but some of which are entirely unique to the dungeon system. The Watchdog of the Old Lords is one of the dungeon-specific bosses and is encountered in the Thumerian Chalice Dungeons, where its design suggests a creature that has been positioned as a guardian of the Thumerian civilization's underground territories for an extended period. The Watchdog is a massive, four-legged creature that breathes fire and appears to have been fossilized or calcified in its guardian role, continuing its function long after the civilization it guarded has ceased to exist. The guardian outlasted its purpose. The function survived the civilization. The Merciless Watchers are another dungeon-specific encounter type, appearing as a group of 3 enemies in Thumerian chalices, who use a combination of melee and ranged attacks. The grouping of 3 in both the Merciless Watchers and the Shadow of Yharnam from the main game points toward a Thumerian preference for 3-unit guardian configurations that appears across the civilization's architectural design. The pattern suggests that the number 3 carried specific symbolic or tactical significance in Thumerian defensive philosophy, and encountering it in multiple contexts suggests deliberate cultural design rather than coincidence. The Thumerians built things in 3s. They defended things in 3s. The number is a signature. The Bloodletting Beast is one of the most physically impressive unique bosses in the Chalice Dungeons, and is encountered in a form that makes its relationship to beast transformation explicitly biological rather than magical. The creature's body appears to have been torn open and sutured in multiple places, suggesting a medical or experimental intervention on a transformed beast rather than a natural state. This reads as evidence that the Thumerians were not simply researchers of the blood, but active practitioners of blood-based surgery and physical modification, conducting experiments on beasts in a systematic way that left physical records on the beasts themselves. They were doing this before the healing church. Everything the church developed had precedence. The Thumerian Descendant is one of the most nimble bosses in the Chalice Dungeons, using a weapon in both hands and moving with a speed and precision that distinguishes it from the other Thumerian enemies. Its design suggests a trained combatant rather than a transformed creature or a positioned guardian, which places it in a category of Thumerian civilization that was specifically dedicated to elite martial practice. The Thumerians were not simply a scholarly civilization. They had warriors, and the Descendant is a representation of what that warrior tradition looked like at its highest level. The underground world produced scientists and soldiers. The church that descended from their research inherited only the science. The Thumerian Elder is found in the deeper Chalice Dungeons and is notable for its specifically magical attack set, using energy projectiles, an area of effect abilities that suggest a practitioner of arcane arts, rather than a physical combatant. The combination of warrior and arcane practitioner types among the Thumerian bosses, represented by the Descendant and the Elder respectively, suggests a civilization that developed both traditions and considered them equally important. The underground civilization that the Healing Church's research traced back to was not a primitive precursor, but a sophisticated parallel culture with its own advanced specializations that predated the Church's by a significant margin. The Loran Dark Beast found in the Loran Chalice dungeons is a variant of Dark Beast Pal that appears in a dungeon system associated with the civilization of Loran rather than with Yharnam proper. The Loran civilization is described in item descriptions as a culture that also engaged with the Great Ones and suffered a similar fate, and the presence of a dark beast in its dungeon system suggests that the Beast Plague and its most extreme manifestations were not unique to Yharnam's specific blood practices. Loran also produced dark beasts. Loran also burned. The pattern suggests a convergent outcome for any civilization that engaged deeply enough with the old blood and the beings associated with it. The same process produces the same result, regardless of who's conducting it. The defiled watchdog and the defiled amygdala are the most mechanically punishing bosses in the Chalice dungeon system, both appearing in the defiled Chalice, where all damage received is doubled. The word defiled in the Bloodborne context refers to something that has been ritually corrupted or made impure, and the defiled Chalice as a dungeon system represents the deepest and most corrupted layer of the Pthumerian underground. The bosses encountered there being specifically more dangerous than their surface counterparts is a representation of what the deep layer of the underground does to things. It amplifies, it intensifies, it takes what already exists and pushes it further in whatever direction it was already going. The amygdala as a boss is first encountered in the main game during the Yahargul nighttime area, but its Chalice dungeon version is where the creature is studied at most depth by the community. The amygdala as a creature type has been associated in community analysis with the concept of the amygdala in human neuroscience, the brain structure associated with fear and emotional memory processing. The Great One creatures, called amygdalae, might be named for their role in the architecture of cosmic horror, beings whose very presence generates the emotional response that their name describes. You are scared of the amygdala because it exists to be feared. That's its function in the architecture of what you're being exposed to. The Pthumerian Queen Yharnam, found in the deepest Chalice dungeons, is one of the most narratively significant bosses in Bloodborne that the majority of players never encounter. She is the source of the name Yharnam itself, the queen of the Pthumerian civilization, who was used by the Healing Church as the source of the blood that the Church then distributed. Her boss fight is unique in that she appears to be heavily pregnant and uses blood manipulation as her primary attack mechanic, and the specific image of a powerful figure being exploited for what her blood can produce, surrounded by the ruins of the civilization that exploitation consumed, is the most literal visual statement in the game about what the Healing Church's entire program was actually built on.